So in many ways, World War One is absolutely a continuation of the progressive era, in part because obviously we see Woodrow Wilson as, again, the third of the three progressive presidents. So we're going to be talking a ton about Woodrow Wilson and in many ways what we call idealism and sort of how he viewed the world and what he'd be able to do. So when we have to think about sort of this supreme faith in America's historic destiny, and the righteousness of its own ideals, that's very much Wilsonian beliefs. And in that regard, it allowed Wilson and other leaders to think of the United States both as an emerging great power, as it had become really as a result of the industrialization of the Gilded Age, and this worldwide embodiment of freedom. They're not necessarily contradictory, but at times they certainly can be. So the view that historians have given to Wilson is known as liberal internationalism. And more than anybody else, Wilson sort of articulated this vision of liberal internationalism to the rest of the world. And his foreign policy rested on the conviction that economic and political progress went hand in hand. Thus, greater worldwide freedom would follow inevitably from increased American intervention in trade abroad. So again, as America would find new markets, it would spread its freedom that it is so well known for. Obviously, don't ask many of the people in the United States who aren't free about that, but that was, of course, what Wilson was projecting. And this idea of liberal internationalism represented a shift from the 19th century, remember the 1800s, where there'd been a tradition of promoting freedom by example. So in some ways, going all the way back to 1630, like, we shall be a city upon a hill. But instead of being an exemplar, it's going to be actively involved to make the world safe for democracy, as Wilson is going to say, okay? So when you look at Wilson's foreign policy, there was a paradox there, okay? And Wilson really embodied that paradox because this is a man who spoke a ton about freedom. Again, his most famous statement is, I'm going to make the world safe for democracy, yet they're the ones that are most likely to intervene in the affairs of other nations. Again, it doesn't always contradict. Again, if you're saying, I'm invoking freedom to help other people, but again, anytime that you intervene, you're not exactly helping them be free. Now, there's a ton of interesting information about Wilson in Mexico that leads to actually an attack on Columbus, New Mexico, a little known attack on American soil, but I'm not going to have you read it, okay? Or I'm sorry, I'm not going to ask you to have questions. You can certainly read it. So the war breaks out in Europe in 1914. And it divides the United States, particularly between British Americans, who obviously side with their nation of origin, as did many other Americans. Again, remember, despite the fact that you fought the Revolution and you fought the War of 1812 against Britain, we've had a long relationship with Britain and really have always looked at Britain as sort of our cousin, if you will, okay? And so there's always been an association, believe it or not, even though we fought against them for our liberty, but looking at Great Britain as a place of liberty and democracy. Again, that's where we were sort of spawned from, we feel like. And there's always been a view of Germany as having much more of a repressive government. Now, on the other hand, you have 9 million German Americans in the United States, and they identify with Germany. Then you've got Irish Americans, who we know that there are many immigrants from Ireland going all the way back to the middle of the 1800s, and they hate the British. So again, you've got British Americans and many other Americans who are on the side of Britain. Then on the other side, you've got German Americans who are on the side of Germany and Irish Americans who don't want to help the British. And then you've got many immigrants, remember the new immigrants from really Eastern Europe, from the Russian Empire, especially Jewish immigrants, who have no desire to see the United States aiding the Tsar's regime. So again, Russia is going to ultimately be on the side of Britain. And there are many Russians who are like, we don't like that repressive Tsar. We don't want to help him out in any way. So certainly a divided country. And so Wilson's got to look at this, when war breaks out, and he's got to sort of come up with a policy. And when war does break out, Wilson officially proclaims American neutrality. There's plenty of reason for him to go to both sides based on the people that were in America. But this naval warfare in Europe reverberates to the United States. So even though the war is over there, it still has impact here, because Britain declares a naval blockade on Germany, basically saying, we have the strongest navy in the world. We're going to keep other countries from trading with you, something that Britain actually did to its colonies way back when. Okay. And so American merchant vessels get sort of caught in all of this. And Germany realizes, you know what? We can't compete sort of on the water, so we're going to go below the water. So they use submarine warfare against ships entering and leaving British ports. So most famously or infamously, in May of 1915, a German submarine sank the British liner, the Lusitania, which Germany said, it's carrying weapons, so it's fair game. It was carrying a large cache of small arms, okay, not necessarily a military ship by any means. It was a passenger ship that was carrying some weapons, and it killed almost 1,200 passengers off the coast of Ireland, including over 100 Americans. So as you can imagine, the sinking of the Lusitania outraged the American public. And it strengthened the belief of those who said the United States has to get ready for war. Look, American lives are in danger. Now, Wilson is sort of naturally predisposed by his background to be pro-British, and he does not necessarily like Germany, but he doesn't go to war. That's very important. So even though the Lusitania is sunk, he doesn't go to war. But he does embark on a policy of what was known as preparedness, which is sort of this crash program to expand the American Army and Navy, just in case, okay? So keep in mind, the war starts in 1914, Lusitania is in 1915. The United States is not actually going to go into war until 1917, though. So don't get fooled. The Lusitania does not draw us into war, just as the Boston Massacre in 1770 didn't draw the United States into the Revolution. So Wilson is going to run for his second term in 1916. And as he is running in 1916, Germany basically says, okay. We are going to suspend our submarine warfare against non-combatants. Basically, if you're neutral, you don't have to worry. Technically, the German term was unrestricted U-boat warfare, and they said, we're not going to do it, okay? And it seems that Wilson's preparedness program seemed to have succeeded. Like, listen, the United States is ready to go to war if we need to. And so Germany sort of backs down. And Wilson runs on this policy in 1916 of, quote, he kept us out of war. So again, vote him back in. He has navigated this neutrality so successfully. And the Republican Party, remember, in 1912 was in disarray with the Bull Moose, Roosevelt folks and the incumbent Taft folks. But now they actually get their party back together. And ultimately, with Wilson saying, I'm not going to send American soldiers to Europe, he actually does very, very well in 10 of the 12 states that had adopted women's suffrage. Remember, the 19th Amendment has not yet been passed. But so he does very, very well with those states that allow women to vote. And really, without the votes of women, Wilson would not have been reelected, which is, again, ironic, because at that point, he hadn't even, gone out on a limb and promised women's suffrage. So he still got the women's vote nonetheless. Now, Germany, who had, again, suspended this unrestricted U-boat warfare, the beginning of 1917, after, Wilson is reelected, they start again. They get very desperate. So almost immediately, Germany announces their intention to resume the submarine warfare against ships sailing to and from the British Isles, and several more American vessels are sunk. Remember, the Lusitania was not an American vessel. It was a British vessel carrying Americans. So in March 1917, there's something else that happens. British spies intercept and they make public this damning Zimmerman telegram, which was a message from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmerman telling Mexico, hey, listen, I know you guys lost, all of this land way back in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Cool name. Hey, if you join us, you could get that land back. Because, if we fight the Americans and you're on our side and we defeat the Americans, look, you can get all that land back. Totally, really a preposterous idea. And really, when it was put out there, it was just really to inflame the American public. And so with the Zimmerman telegram, but really with the resumption of unrestricted U-boat warfare, the day after my grandma was born, although my grandma was born 2 years after this. Okay, so I guess it's 365 plus 364 days before my grandma was born. On April 2nd, 1917, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany. And again, making the famous quote that I have said over and over again, the world must be made safe for democracy. And the United States is the one that's going to do it. Now, later that year in 1917, huge move in Russia. Okay, so you've got the Communist Revolution headed by Lenin overthrows the Russian Czar. Now, this is a really interesting move because, again, many Americans had reservations about being on the side of Russia with their autocratic czar. And we're actually sort of interested in like, hey, is Lenin going to be more democratic? This could be great. We could, fight on the side of Russia and not feel bad about it. But shortly thereafter, after Lenin takes over, they withdraw Russia from the war and publish a secret treaties by which the Allies had agreed to divide up conquered territory after the war. So this looks really, really bad for Wilson and the other allies who had said we're going to have, a total just peace, and this is not for, gaining territory and conquering. So it, again, starting to see that cleavage between the, United States and its allies and its former ally, Russia, now the Soviet Union. Now, it's really important to understand that even during the war, Wilson was angling to sort of dictate the peace after the war. So Wilson had to sort of keep reminding Americans, listen, this is for a moral cause. In many ways, this is a progressive war to help sort of clean up what is going on in the world, and particularly in Europe. So in January of 1918, not even a year after the United States entered the war, and again, not going to be for about a year until the war is over, Wilson issues what's known as the 14 Points, which was the clearest statement of sort of America in terms of its war aims, but also its vision of this new international order for after the war. And among the key principles that Wilson mentioned was self-determination for all peoples. That would basically mean that you could sort of determine if you were going to be your own country based on sort of the ethnic groups that were there. It's actually really challenging to do because many different ethnic groups are like, well, we want our own country, and it seems actually somewhat unfeasible. But he wanted freedom of the seas, something that, again, America had been fighting for since it was its colonies, free trade, open diplomacy, and an end to secret treaties. There was a bunch of treaties that actually triggered the beginning of World War I. They wanted the readjustment of colonial claims, basically making sure that, people that were part of empires could, in fact, sort of have a say, which is, again, a bit ironic since America just sort of built its own little empire, not 2 decades earlier. And then sort of most importantly, this creation of a general association of nations to preserve the peace. Now, Wilson envisioned this last provision, which led to the establishment after the war of something known as the League of Nations, as a kind of sort of global counterpart to all these sort of commissions that the progressives had created at home to maintain social harmony, all these sort of organizations of, academics and smart people who would analyze stuff. And in many ways, the 14 Points established the agenda for the peace conference after the war, even though, as we're going to find out, many of Wilson's plans actually never got sort of agreed to. Okay. Now, I spoke about sort of how this is a progressive war. And in many ways, World War I is sort of considered the end of the progressive era, although technically you are going to get the 18th and 19th Amendments, again, for prohibition and women's suffrage, sort of after the war. But really, the war is considered the end, and then you're going to get into the next sort of era, the 1920s. But for most progressives, the war offered this possibility of reforming American society at home along scientific ideals, instilling a sense of national unity and self-sacrifice, in expanding social justice. And so it's really important to also understand that America saw that it could sort of export its progressivism in terms of, using the government as an agency of social welfare in other places that could sort of, again, become sort of mini Americas. Like, we will make you better through our sort of commitment to freedom and equality, which, again, not everybody home was free and equal, which is, again, I guess, ironic. So it's important to understand that when you are fighting a war, particularly a war of this magnitude, the government has to take some pretty major actions. And so what we're going to see is a bunch of sort of new agencies that get created at home to help the United States fight the war. Again, when you're fighting a war, you need to be really strong at home. So the Selective Service Act of 1917, just about a month after the United States entered the war, 24 million men were required to register for the draft. Okay. Now, of course, we'd seen drafts in the Civil War. People could pay their way out. Couldn't do that particularly in this war. The WIB, or the War Industries Board, they got a Wall Street whiz named Bernard Baruch, and he led the WIB in terms of sort of having the power to preside over all elements of war production, from the distribution of raw materials. So, we've got these raw materials, private industry, you can't use them, they're needed for war, to basically saying you can't charge too much for manufactured goods. And we'll talk about that in terms of inflation during the war. Now, it also was looking to make sure that, our industrial might could be used best to serve the war. So to spur efficiency, it established standardized specifications for pretty much everything. So when you're in a war, the government sort of took over and created much more of this planned economy, from everything from like what automobile tires could be to the fact that you could only have 3 different type of socks, 3 different color socks that were being made. But please understand that in World War II, the government takes over much more than it actually does in World War I. In World War I, the WIB was given the power, but it didn't fully execute that power. Whereas in World War II, something called the War Production Board will do much more. Now, the Railroad Administration is going to basically take control over the nation's transportation system and actually create, I think we're going to see time zones as a result, certainly, of the war. The Food Administration, led by none other than Herbert Hoover, who's going to be president later on. And the Food Administration basically tells, farmers how to best grow their crops, to be more efficient. It's also going to promote what are known as like meatless days and wheatless days, to ration types of foods so that that food could actually be sent abroad to our soldiers. Then you've got the War Labor Board, very, very interesting phenomenon here. And I want you to understand that during wars, labor does much better. Unions actually get a bunch of what they want, basically in exchange for, quote unquote, being good. Like if you don't strike and, you keep your people in line, then, we'll get you what you want. So you had representatives from the government, from industry, and of course from the AFL. And they worked together and they created an establishment of minimum wage, 8-hour workday, holy Moses, part of the Holy Trinity, and the right to form unions, which again, still there were some questions about, when you could actually form unions in certain facilities. And so during the war, wages actually went up, working conditions in many industries improved, and union membership doubled. So it's a really, really important note that sort of in combination with the Clayton Antitrust Act, which had been passed earlier in the progressive era, along with World War I, labor does really well. Well, in the 1920s, labor does really poorly. So again, when times are tough, and war includes that, labor does well. When times are good, as the 1920s are, labor does poorly. Now, you've got to finance the war, just like we have seen going all the way back to the Revolutionary War. We've got questions of how you're going to get your money. And again, back then, even in the Revolution, you had people that sort of gave, money to the government. They got an IOU and the government didn't pay them back as much or in time. And that was certainly something that pissed people off, leading to Shays' Rebellion way back when. And so one of the ways that the United States does it here is they increase income taxes. So remember, we actually had the 16th Amendment, which had created an income tax, although during wars, income taxes have been used in the past, including the Civil War. But you're also going to have what are known as Liberty bonds. Again, so you go to the American people, you say, please buy these bonds, for $100 to help finance the war. We'll give you 105 when the war is over. And it's considered patriotic to help finance the war. And you hope that you get paid back. Okay. Now, there were definitely people who opposed the war. I already told you about the German Americans, the Irish Americans who did not like that we were fighting along the Allies. But you also have folks like the IWW, the Wobblies, the International Workers of the World, who'd always been sort of the more radical of, the labor unions at the time, the AFL and the IWW, the ones that were around in the early 1900s. And then you have the Socialist Party, which had been founded in 1901. And in 1917, they condemned the declaration of war as a crime against the people of the United States. So basically, by declaring war to fight people abroad, you were actually declaring war sort of on the people of the United States, in part because you're going to see this argument that going to war is simply going to benefit capitalism and war, weapons makers, and we're going to certainly see that as well. And that, so socialists were very much thinking that this was just a capitalist-driven war. Now, to combat any sort of opposition to the war, and also to sort of get everybody rowing the boat in the same direction, as they say, the Wilson administration created what was known as the CPI, or the Committee on Public Information, to explain to the Americans, in the words of its director, George Creel, so we need to make sure that, everyone understands why America is taking up arms and defending its liberties and its free institutions. So the CPI had a ton of people sort of going out and giving speeches known as 4-minute men, who would give these 4-minute speeches pretty much in any place. It's very much a pro-war propaganda. They use pamphlets, posters, newspaper advertisements, motion pictures, really to try to make everybody believe in what America was doing. But at the same time, there are people that are actively against the war, as I said, the IWW, socialists, German Americans, Irish Americans. And so the government goes out on a limb, and it's actually going to create laws that restrict what people can say or do against the government. So you have the Espionage Act in 1917 that not only prohibits spying and spying for the other side, but interfering with the draft, but also anything that you might say, false statements that might impede military success. And so actually, we're going to have a famous case that is not mentioned here called Shank versus the United States, where Charles Shank speaks out. He's a socialist, and he speaks out against the draft, and his speech is limited, and he sues. And the Supreme Court ultimately says that during war, free speech can be limited, and says that his speech created what was known as clear and present danger, because by speaking out against the draft, people might not go to the draft, and it can endanger American lives. So it's a very famous free speech case, and I'm pretty embarrassed that Foner didn't include it here, okay? Now, the Espionage Act allowed the Postmaster General, that's the head of the post office, to bar basically a bunch of newspapers and magazines from being transmitted through the mail that were critical of what Wilson's administration was doing. So certainly we see, freedom of the press not exactly happening during the war. You also have the Sedition Act, which sort of builds on the Espionage Act from a year earlier, that made it a crime to make basically spoken or printed statements that intended in any way to sort of criticize the government or interfere with the war effort. It's not exactly the same as the Espionage Act. It's a little broader, but ultimately you are going to see that Eugene V Debs, yes, the Eugene V Debs from Pullman and the Eugene V Debs from the election of 1912, he is convicted under the Espionage Act for delivering an anti-war speech. He's sentenced for 10 years. He actually appeals to Woodrow Wilson, who, again, had been, one of the guys running against him 6 years earlier. And Wilson's like, I'm not helping you out, okay? But there was also sort of an auxiliary group that was not fully government, but not fully private either. It's sort of a mix there. And it's called the American Protective League, or the APL. There was about 250,000 members of this APL that worked with the Justice Department to point out who the radicals were and who the critics of the war. So you'd have like neighbors spying on neighbors. And they carried out what were known as slacker raids, in which they would stop men on the street of major cities and be like, where's your draft registration card? Are you not going to the draft? Are you slacking? And employers often cooperate with the government in making sure that, again, the IWW couldn't get any power. And this is something that business interests, had long wanted. And so in 1917, operating under one of the broadest warrants in American history. That means basically with very little evidence, they got a warrant. Federal agents swooped in and basically just ransacked IWW offices throughout the country and arrested a ton of their leaders. Okay. Now, when we look at this and we say, wait a second, from, an Espionage Act, a Sedition Act, this case that I mentioned, Shank versus the United States, Eugene V Debs, the American Protective League going after the IWW. Like, why aren't progressives speaking out more against this suppression of freedom of expression? Aren't the progressives about freedom? And it is true that some progressives spoke out, but most failed to speak out because civil liberties, by and large, had never been a major concern of the progressives. And they always had looked at the government, once it could be cleaned up, as the embodiment of democratic purpose, and basically said freedom flowed from participating in the life of society, not standing in opposition. So I know it's weird because, again, the progressives, fought to clean up the government. And so in some ways they did oppose what the government was doing until it was cleaned up. But they really thought that you had to be involved in society to make it better. And they felt like many people who were speaking out against the war were really against society. So the progressives did believe in a strong national government once it was cleaned up. And many of the critics of the war were actually complaining about what this strong government was doing. Now, it's really interesting that the United States goes to war against Germany because really going back to when Germans started coming over, they were sort of seen as the model immigrant in a way, particularly in contrast to the Irish who came at the same time, and also the Chinese who came at the same time, albeit to the West Coast. And the first wave of German immigrants had come, in the late 1840s, early 1850s. And by 1914, when the war broke out, German Americans numbered 9 million in the United States. And they'd created really sort of strong ethnic institutions, sport associations, schools, and theaters. And in fact, people in America were very much appreciative of the German traditions of literature, music, and philosophy. And again, it wasn't like you took Spanish as a language. A quarter of American students were taking German as a language. But after America enters the war against Germany and the Kaiser, the use of German and the expression of and the appreciation of German culture became something that you just were not allowed to do. And in fact, by 1919, really the end of the war, the vast majority of states had enacted laws restricting the teaching not just of German, but of foreign languages altogether. So it became very sort of what we would call sort of an anti-hyphenated American society, sort of 100% pure American sort of vision post-war. And popular words, of German origin, like hamburger became Liberty sandwich, and sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage, and dachshunds, the little wiener dogs, they became known as Liberty pups. So again, we're not going to honor Germany in any way. Okay. Now, speaking broadly about immigration, the war strengthened the condition that certain types of people were undesirable and ought to be excluded. Now, again, we'd certainly seen this at the end of the 1900s with, the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 and 1892. We'd certainly seen it with the Immigration Restriction League and the American Protective Association that came up in the 1890s against the new immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. But it really became this idea that, there was this white Anglo-Saxon and everybody else, really was inferior. And we're going to see that really spilling over into the 1920s. So the war really sort of closes the door on immigration, and the 1920s is a particularly xenophobic era. Now, it is interesting because during the war, you're going to see an increase in Mexicans coming to California and the Southwest, in part because the need for labor in the area's mines and in its farms, particularly because, so many men had to leave to go fight the war. But that doesn't mean that Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the area were treated well at all. So there was segregation by law, which means de jure, and by custom, which means de facto. And you saw that just as you saw throughout the American South. So in the American Southwest, you saw it with Mexicans the same way you saw it with African Americans in the South. So in schools and hospitals and theaters and other institutions, you saw this. I don't even know if you'd call it separate but equal. It was just separate, okay? And He certainly saw this in schools. And in fact, in Phoenix, Arizona, they established separate schools for Indians, Mexicans, blacks, and whites. So different schools for everybody. And there was lynching throughout the Southwest, not like we saw with the numbers of African Americans in the South, but certainly that was a way that people were punished. I hate to use that term because the punishment never fit the crime, even if there was a crime. Oftentimes there wasn't even a crime. Now, in San Francisco in 1906, what we're going to see here is the San Francisco School Board is going to order all Asian students combined into a single public school. Okay, so again, Chinese and Japanese as well. And the Japanese government protests and like, what are you doing? And Teddy Roosevelt's, oh, okay, I'll get the city to integrate the schools again. But the sort of trade was something called the Gentleman's Agreement in 1907, where Japan basically said, okay, we're not going to send any Japanese immigrants to the United States, except for wives and children of men who are already in the country. So this is not as restrictive as the Chinese Exclusion Act, but it certainly is anti-Asian, anti-Japanese, not certainly at the level of keeping out all immigrants, all Chinese immigrants, as we saw in 1892. And then 1882, 1892, and renewed permanently in 1902. But in 1913, California basically says anybody who's Asian cannot become a citizen, and is making sure they can't even own or lease land. So California, where you saw, the largest Asian population in the country at that point, is becoming very, very Asian, or I should say continuing to be very, very anti-Asian. Now, you've got to look in the South what's going on with African Americans. And so we certainly understand what had happened during the Jim Crow era after Reconstruction in terms of literacy tests and grandfather clauses and poll taxes to disenfranchise so many African Americans in the South. They also, aside from not really being able to vote, can't join most unions in terms of skilled employment. And nor could they really ever have the money to engage in the consumer economy, either as employees of stores that were selling these goods, other than being janitors or custodians, or as buyers of these goods that are going to now flood the marketplace. And you wonder, like, where were these progressives in terms of speaking out for African Americans? They're speaking out for children, they're speaking out for labor, they're speaking out for women. Where are they? Well, they're pretty much silent on improving the Black condition. Most settlement house reformers accepted segregation as sort of just part of what's going on. It's natural. And white leaders of the suffrage movement infamously sort of didn't really care about Black female enfranchisement. So again, despite the fact the progressive era is supposed to be looking out for the little guy, it was not looking out for African Americans. And in office, you have Woodrow Wilson from Virginia. Definitely not a racially progressive place. And his administration is going to impose racial segregation in federal departments in Washington, D.C. He's going to dismiss a number of Black employees. And perhaps what has come to sort of symbolize his racism the most was he allowed this film, at the time, a famous film, The Birth of the Nation, but it glorifies the KKK, and he allowed it to have a premiere at the White House. And certainly people look back and they say, that is an unbelievably terrible look for a film that glorifies the KKK as really the saviors of the South to be played in the White House. Now, it is interesting to understand that W.E.B. Du Bois is still a key figure in the African-American civil rights movement. So he's actually sort of not totally contemporaneous with Booker T. Washington. So Du Bois has started the Niagara movement, which really morphs into the NAACP, which is still around today. But what you're going to see here is this encouragement of the Black press to really rally to get African Americans involved in the war. And Du Bois himself, in what is known as The Crisis, which was the NAACP's monthly magazine, he says to African Americans to, quote, close ranks, enlist in the army, and basically you help America promote freedom, abroad, but also to really bring dignity so white people can see just how remarkable it is that African Americans are fighting for this. And Black participation in the Civil War had actually helped, end slavery and achieve citizenship really in the 14th Amendment, which wasn't obviously being followed during Jim Crow. But during World War I, closing ranks did not actually bring any significant gains. The Navy barred blacks entirely from serving, and the Army segregated the 400,000 soldiers who basically had to be in much lower sort of work supply units rather than in combat, okay? But there's a very important development that happened with African Americans during this war at home as opposed to abroad. And so you're going to see, obviously, there's increased wartime production. There's much less immigration to the United States during this war and pretty much every war. And so it opens a ton of industrial jobs to Black laborers for the first time. And so we're going to see this large scale great migration from the South to the North. So on the eve of the war, we had 90% of African Americans still living in the South. But between 1910 and 1920, 500,000 African Americans are going to leave the South, and then it's going to actually just continue all the way basically through the 1940s. So the Black population in Chicago doubles. New York City goes up 66%. And then smaller cities like Akron and Buffalo and Trenton, New Jersey shows similar gains. And many motives, sort of undergird this great migration. Higher wages in northern factories are much better than what you could get in the South. Opportunities for educating their children. Obviously, you don't have separate but equal in the North, to escape the threat of lynching and the prospect of actually being able to vote. But many of these young men and women and their young families who carried with them this new vision of opportunity and social and economic freedom encountered disappointments because they didn't necessarily get the jobs they wanted. They were excluded from unions. They were basically put in Black housing, so rigid housing segregation. And you're going to see many instances of white on Black violence that basically say, well, the North is maybe not that much better than the South in many ways. And so it's very, very interesting to note that African Americans will continue to go from the South to the North, through the 1920s, through the Great Depression, really up to World War II, but it's not always as good as people thought it was going to be. Now, in particular, you're going to see three instances during the war and immediately right after the war that represent the terrible racial violence that's going on. So East St. Louis, which is actually in Illinois, dozens of African Americans were killed in 1917 when employers recruited Black workers. Okay, so they recruited them from the South to come to the St. Louis area as a way to weaken unions. And many of, sort of essentially as scabs or as lower wage workers. And you're going to see white on Black violence. Right here in Chicago in 1919, you're going to see a terrible riot that we'll go over when we talk about the 1920s, where basically there were Black beaches and white beaches on Lake Michigan, and a Black teenager accidentally crossed this unofficial dividing line, and it got really, really bad and really, really bloody and quite violent. And by the time the National Guard had restored order, 38 people had been killed, 500 people injured, and large parts of Black Chicago had actually been burned down. Now, speaking of burning down, Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is where my mom is from, had what until recently most people did not know about, but a terrible, terrible race riot occurred when more than 300 African Americans were killed and 10,000 African Americans were left homeless after a white mob that included police and National Guardsmen basically burned this entire city called part of the city called Greenwood, or the Black Wall Street, to the ground. And it's, again, only recently have people really started to pay attention to just how vibrant this community was and just how tragic the loss of it was. Now, at the same time, you're going to have this man named Marcus Garvey, who we'll talk about more in the 1920s, who sort of gets his word out in the new densely populated ghettos of the North. And there's going to be this organization that he founds called the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, that really is focusing on African independence and Black self-reliance. So basically, buy from Black businesses, okay? Like the whole way that African Americans can do better economically is if we don't buy from white stores, we buy from Black stores. And so in many ways, Marcus Garvey is also preaching what's known as sort of a Pan-African identity, that all people who'd originally come from Africa should see themselves really as Black together. Now, many of the sort of more respected African-American civil rights leaders like Du Bois looked at Garvey as sort of a charlatan, sort of a fraud. And ultimately, the government does convict him of mail fraud, and they were not too upset about it. Now, a weird transition from Garvey over to Lenin, and I don't know how to do it otherwise. But what you're going to see here is that there'd been some hope that Lenin would bring, better times to Russia, which they're now calling the Soviet Union. But that is not going to happen. So you're going to see that the government nationalizes land holdings, banks, and factories, and proclaims this socialist dream of a workers' government. That being said, as we are going to see, they really do not give the power to the people. But what it does do is it does create some concerns in America that there's sort of this creeping socialist communist influence. Now, I know that communism and socialism are not the same, but in America's ideas, they were. If you're going to have the USSR, which proclaims itself a socialist state practicing communism, then in the end, we just sort of used the words interchangeably at the time. So in 1919, right after the end of World War I, more than 4 million workers engage in strikes, which is the greatest wave of labor unrest in American history. And so we're going to talk. That often happens after a war. You have sort of economic shocks going through. There were walkouts, again, where workers walked off the job by textile workers, telephone operators, Broadway actors, and we're actually going to see, they don't mention it here, but there's a major strike in Seattle, but there's a huge strike right in Chicago called the 1919 Steel Strike that had about 365,000 mostly immigrant workers who struck in demands for union recognition, higher wages, and an 8-hour workday. So again, there's certain allowances that are made during war that sort of go away after war, and those workers want them back. And in response to the strike, the steel owners launched a very strategic counterattack, and employers appealed to anti-immigrant sentiment amongst native-born workers, many of whom had come back to work, after the war, and they conducted this propaganda campaign that associated the strikers with, the IWW, communism, and disloyalty. And so, again, while labor unions had this sort of deal during the war with the government, sort of like the deal is off at the end and labor becomes sort of public enemy number one again, and that's going to continue through the 1920s. So you see something in 1919 and 1920 that really is associated with this fear of communism known as the Red Scare. And so it's not long, but it's pretty intense. And so what you're going to see is concerns about the effects of the Russian Revolution right here in the United States, and looking at the labor stoppages that had occurred, like this Seattle strike that's not mentioned in your book, and the steel strike that is mentioned in your book. The Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, in late 1919 and early 1920 is going to dispatch federal agents to raid the offices of radical and labor organizations throughout the country, sort of like what we saw with the ransacking of the IWW during the war. And more than 5,000 people are arrested, most of them without warrants, and held for months without charge. And the government is also going to deport hundreds of immigrant radicals. So again, you saw the crackdown during the war by the American Protection League. You're also going to see a crackdown by the Justice Department after the war. And so when you look at what were known as the Palmer raids, named after the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, the reaction to the Palmer raids plants the seeds for a new appreciation of the importance of civil liberties. Now, you're going to see that. So in the long term, you're going to ultimately see people starting to push back against the government. But in the immediate impact, right there in 1919 and 1920, basically, it has this effect of really identifying patriotic Americans for people that are supporting this, what Warren G. Harding, who comes in the presidency, is going to call this return to normalcy. So this sort of political and economic status quo. And, in this process of the Red Scare and the Palmer raids, the IWW is going to basically be destroyed, and many unions are going to be in disarray, and the Socialist Party is really going to crumble. So you do see, people that had protested the war and people that protested sort of where America was going after the war really are crushed. Now, we're going to get right now to sort of the post-war issues that are being dealt with abroad at the Treaty of Versailles. So in the end, Woodrow Wilson had promised this sort of just and lasting peace based on his 14 points, and he's not able to get it. He travels to France, and again, your book does not go into how his travels actually really inflamed problems in the United States, but he's going to be the American representative at the Versailles Peace Conference, the first American president to ever travel abroad during his presidency. But he is sort of outmatched by his British counterpart, David Lloyd George, and his French counterpart, George Clemenceau. And so ultimately, in his 14 points, he said that you can't have any secret treaties. He called for open covenants, openly arrived at, but the negotiations end up being in secret. And in the end, the Treaty of Versailles does create the League of Nations, which was truly central to Wilson's idea for this new international order. It does also apply the principle of self-determination to Eastern Europe. Remember, self-determination is ethnic groups sort of getting to choose their own sort of sovereign status, but it's going to prove to actually be pretty challenging, okay? And in the end, this, just and lasting peace that it's supposed to have, the Treaty of Versailles turns out to be quite a harsh document. So in the end, David Lloyd George persuades Woodrow Wilson to agree to what is known as the guilt clause, where it makes Germany declare that they are morally responsible for the war and that they have to basically pay back money because they started the war. And so it's variously been estimated at 33 billion, which is the number I've always used. Foner uses the term 56 billion. And that ultimately is going to cripple the German economy and lead to the rise of Nazism. Okay. Now, in the end, we look back at Woodrow Wilson's term for self-determination, and there are colonial people around the world that are seeking independence and are excited by this. In fact, a man who doesn't go by Ho Chi Minh at the time, but will go by Ho Chi Minh later, who's the Vietnamese nationalist leader who we will fight in the Vietnam War. He, in fact, was in France at the time. He's like, could you give my people freedom from France? French-controlled Vietnam at the time. It's a long story. We'll get to that later. But in the end, Wilson's belief in self-determination was, yeah, you can get it, but you're going to need a long time sort of under care, we call it tutelage, before you're ready for independence. Sort of the way that America looked at the Philippines, okay? And so when we look back and we say, what did this failure of Wilson's idealistic 14 points really lead to? And in the end, it creates this cynicism about what America was talking about with freedom and democracy. It's like, yeah, you guys talk about that, but you weren't devastated by war. You don't really understand. And then in the end, basically, Wilson seems to sort of give up on his plan, and he accedes to what the needs are for the British and the French and doesn't really go through with it. And then we know that, as I just said before, this German resentment of the peace terms, the particularly harsh peace terms, the guilt clause and the reparations payments are only going to sow the seeds for Hitler in the 1930s. Now, you have this League of Nations, and Woodrow Wilson looks at the League of Nations like, yes, I got this done. We're now going to have an organization where countries can come together and they can basically make it so there's going to be no more war. But many Americans, particularly American politicians, looked at the League and said, wait a second, if we get involved in this League of Nations, this organization, and other countries go to war, won't that drag us into war? And thinking back, of course, to the Monroe Doctrine and not wanting to be involved in other countries' affairs unless it's Roosevelt's corollary, which means we'll involve ourselves in Latin America. But you have a bunch of senators who are known as the Reservationists because they have reservations about this Treaty of Versailles. And so they say, we will accept this treaty if you basically make some amendments to it, because we really don't like the fact that if any member of the League of Nations is attacked and go to war, we'll have to go to war. And again, Congress had the power to declare war, but if in fact we were part of the League of Nations, that could supersede it. So many American politicians are like, well, that would absolutely take away a really important constitutional power that we have. But Wilson, who had this God complex in many ways, is basically like, no, I will not negotiate with you. This is what I have brought home from France. You're going to ratify it. And so there's this really fierce debate that, again, Foner doesn't go into and we'll go into in class. Wilson actually goes out to try to convince the American people himself that it's the right idea, and he suffers a serious stroke. And basically for the next year and a half, his wife, Edith, runs the government. Some people call her the first female president. And during this time in November 1919, again, a few months later, in March of 1920, the Senate rejects the Treaty of Versailles. We actually do not sign the Treaty of Versailles that Wilson helped create. We don't join the League of Nations. So really important to understand that this organization that Wilson created to try to, make it so there wouldn't be another war, we didn't join. And probably because we didn't join, it created conditions that led to World War II. We're going to talk much more about that later on. So if you look here, America was not involved in World War I for very long, just over a year and a half. And as I'll talk about in class, and Foner doesn't really talk about, we actually didn't fight for very long overall. But World War I is going to have a really important impact, for better and for worse, into the 1920s. And so what we're going to see is the country that got itself involved in international affairs. And again, prior to that imperialist age and prior to World War I, America had been very reluctant to get involved in world affairs. So after this sort of 20-year period, America is going to be out. But in the long run, you have this Wilsonian idealism, and it is going to continue in some ways. Certainly, we're going to see it with FDR in World War II, this commitment to democracy, open markets, and also to be sort of, again, a city on a hill about American freedom and to use the American military to promote American interests and values. We're not going to see it immediately after the war's over. Like I said, America sort of retreats. But once we get into World War II and the Cold War, many of Wilson's ideals are very much in play. I know this went really long, but again, there was a ton to talk about, even though we actually barely talked about the war itself.